Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of the day you happen to be watching this. I'm glad that you've tuned in to watch Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church Sunday School as we go through a basic overview of the books of the Hebrew Bible, or the books of the First Testament, or the books of the Old Testament, whatever you might like to call it. These are books that are not read as often, and so it's important that we get an idea of what the message of each of these books is. So let's think today about two books that are also a part of the, sometimes called the minor prophets, or called the 12, because there are 12 minor prophets, and in the Hebrew Bible, in the Masoretic text, they are bound together and called the 12. And the two books of the 12 that we'll be looking at today are Micah and Nahum. Both of them are small books, and both of them are fairly obscure books. And so we'll try to get a sense of what's going on in these two books in a flyover kind of way, so that when you decide to read them, you have some hooks to hang what's going on. Micah is an unusual book in that you will find these kinds of messages almost repetitious. The prophets saying, you have gone after other gods, or you have cheated the poor. These are the two of the main things that we see in the minor prophets. And so here we see a microphone, which reminds us of the prophet Micah. And the sun represents the day, and this day is in cord, as you can see from the drawing of a judge. And Micah's key word is a day of judgment. Micah goes to Jerusalem from his hometown in a rural area to deliver God's message of judgment to a corrupt Judah. And he aims his rebukes at those who use their God-given talents and their authority to cheat the poor and abuse the powerless. And Micah specifically calls out false prophets, false judges, false princes, people who ought to know better than what they are doing, and yet they go ahead and continue to act in this way that they never should have acted. And Micah is the prosecutor, and the verdict is guilty. And throughout Micah's ministry, these themes ring clear. One of the themes is that sin will not go unpunished. A second theme is that judgment will be swift and soon. And once the discipline is completed, God will restore his people. So there is though justice is being trampled underfoot, one day, Micah says, after the nation has been punished for that kind of sin, then there will be triumph on the part of God. So Micah is a small book, as you know. It's 7 chapters. It's 105 verses. And so you could read it easily in 45 minutes or an hour. And Micah is a contemporary of Amos and Uzziah. And so he prophesied during this time of unparalleled prosperity. There was a lot of money, a lot of things that people had, that the rich people had. And so Micah was not deceived by this ostensible power and the affluence or the money of his time. God, just as we've seen in other prophets, God neither could nor would overlook the idolatry and the injustice that increasingly characterized the lifestyle of people who had been called to live in a covenant relationship with him. God is saying through Micah, you cannot be God's people and act like this. You must do one or the other. What was it that was the injustice that was so looked down upon by Micah? Well, here we see a couple of them. They confiscate the fields. They desire and seize the houses they want. They defraud people of their homes and deprive people of the land they have inherited. So it's a clear instance of those who are powerful taking advantage of those who are poor, confiscating fields that they want, taking things, houses that they want, and defrauding people through the wrong kind of judgment. And here in Micah 3, very specifically, Micah calls out those leaders. Her leaders take bribes when they decide legal cases. Her priests proclaim rulings for profit, and her prophets read omens for pay. Yet they claim to trust the Lord, and they say the Lord is among us. But they are not really trusting the Lord very clearly because of the fact that they are doing exactly what the Lord has told them not to do. They're following after idols. They are paying prophets to prophesy. And in this case, we think of Balaam, who was paid to prophesy against the nation of Israel. Micah's most famous prophecy, though, is not about the mistreatment of the poor. It's about the coming of the Messiah. In this prophecy in Micah 5:2, it's 5:1 in the MT stands for the Masoretic text, the Hebrew Bible. And this says, "As for you, Bethlehem, Ephrathah," or Bethlehem, small one, seemingly insignificant among the clans of Judah, from you a king will emerge who will rule over Israel on my behalf, and whose origins are in the distant past. And remember that Matthew picks this prophecy up in his own gospel and points it toward Christ. Matthew says, "And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are in no way least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Again and again, we see this word shepherd and sheep, that God is the ultimate shepherd of his people. And so let's think about some passages that convey Micah's message sort of in a nutshell. Here are a few of them. There's woe against the capital cities and their leaders because they are stealing people's land and houses. Micah has that famous prophecy that they will eventually beat their swords into plowshares. That is, eventually the war will end and there will be a time of peace. Then, of course, there's the ruler out of Bethlehem that we just looked at. And that famous passage toward the end of Micah, what does Yahweh require? And then finally, the God of patience. Micah says, "I will wait for the God of my salvation," realizing that there are times when it looks as if God is not coming. There are times when it looks as if God is not really in control. There are times when it looks as if horrible things have happened that shouldn't have. But we do not worry. We wait for the God of our salvation. So, broad picture in terms of a theme is that God will punish the corruption in his people, like the false prophets, the false judges. But ultimately, there will be future salvation. God assures them through Micah his prophet that despite the fact that there are cheating and all kinds of evil going on, there is cheating and all kinds of evil going on, eventually God will provide them salvation. It's written by Micah, who prophesied in Judah sometime around 735 to 700. We don't know the exact dates. Here are some of the cities that are mentioned in Micah. The two really significant ones are Jerusalem and Nineveh. And Jerusalem and Nineveh are two of the cities that are very significant in many of the books of the 12. It's as if Jerusalem is the city of God and Nineveh is the city of man. Nineveh is the capital of Assyria, and Assyrians are the ones who want to come down and take over the people of God and turn them into a different kind of people. In terms of a timeline, again, these are these are rounded numbers. We don't know for sure. But it seems that Micah is prophesying somewhere around this time that Assyria conquers Israel. And Assyria almost conquered Judah, but something happened that gave them the ability to overcome Sennacherib's army. Here's a short outline. Judgment is coming. We see that many times in the prophets. But then we remember that restoration follows judgment, starting in chapter 3. In chapter 6, there's a very serious charge against Israel, but in chapter 7, we end with hope. And the hope is that salvation is coming, that one day, no matter how dark the horizon looks, one day salvation will come. And so you might ask, this is a small book that was written thousands of years ago. Why should you really care about Micah? Well, one of the reasons is that war sweeps across the earth in every generation. There are wars upon wars upon wars, and there are always wars and rumors of wars and different kinds of wars taking place. Micah has a word to say during that time. And we each feel the tensions of our time. I don't think that there's ever been a time in my life when there has been more tension. Tension over the United States leadership, tension over the COVID virus, tension over the misuse of the police force, tension over people doing what they should not do, and some tension over people who are simply going to take the law into their own hands. All of that adds up to real tension that is amplified by the fact that we can get the news 24 hours a day, and the latest news is only a few seconds away, right inside of our pocket, at our phone. And we hear about tragedy everywhere. And in that tragedy, we wonder, what is God doing in the midst of all that? What is God doing in the midst of all the tragedy that we see in the lives of the people around us? Micah looks at the war-torn world of his time. He sees how these incredibly difficult circumstances can prompt God's people to live for Him. And so we also ought to see that these incredibly difficult and tense circumstances in which we live ought to prompt us to live for God. There's a very fascinating thing that happens to stop Sennacherib from coming all the way down south and taking over both of the kingdoms. And this is called the Killer Angels. It harkens to a book about Gettysburg. But in this case, it's real killer angels. In 2 Kings 19, there's a story of Sennacherib's army. And that very night, the Lord's messenger went out and killed 185,000 men in the Assyrian camp. When they got up early the next morning, they were all corpses. What is happening is that Sennacherib's army was camped around, ready to take over the southern kingdom of Israel. And then God stepped in. And God stepped in and killed 185,000 men, soldiers. They went to bed one night and didn't wake up the next morning as the angels came and with their swords drove them away. And so King Sennacherib of Assyria broke camp. He went on his way, he went home, and he stayed in Nineveh. That is a fascinating event. And it tells us that in the 8th century, Assyria turns its attention to the southern kingdom of Judah, and it laid siege to several Judean towns before coming to Jerusalem. Jerusalem being the one town that if they could take that, they could take the entire nation. But the biblical account that we've just read tells us about Assyria's siege of Jerusalem and tells us that Yahweh killed 185,000 Assyrian soldiers while they slept, thinking that they were safe and that all was well and that all was right. At the end of the day, they were not safe, and they eventually died as a result of their turning against God's people. And because of this loss, the Assyrian king Sennacherib and whatever forces were left to him after that night, they went back to Nineveh, their capital. An interesting thing is that there's an inscription found in Sennacherib's palace, and it partly corroborates this account. It says, it admits that Sennacherib did not take Jerusalem, and it says, Hezekiah did not submit to my yoke. Here's a quick drawing of what that prism looks like, and it's written all on all the sides, and there we find that very clear saying that Sennacherib did not take Jerusalem. And he didn't take Jerusalem, he says, because Hezekiah wouldn't submit to him. But we know that he didn't take Jerusalem because of the fact that 185,000 people were killed because they had risen up against God. Perhaps the most famous verse in Micah is this one. He has told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God? So all of us need to realize that if we put pressure and hardship on those that are downtrodden, we are not doing the work of God. John Owen, very famous Puritan preacher, said, "It is often those who are despised and trampled that bear up the weight of a whole nation." So we ourselves realize that in our nation we have those who are despised and trampled, and we ought to do all that we can to help them, not to make their lives worse. So with that, we have figured out what the book of Micah has to say, and we move on to the book of Nahum. Nahum is a strange book, a difficult book in many ways. Here's a picture of it. The key word for the book of Nahum is flood. And here the floodwaters are destroying the city walls which are around Nineveh. In Jonah, the city of Nineveh repents and God does not destroy them. But now they have fallen back. They have done what they shouldn't done. They have degenerated, and they have become a wicked city again, perhaps more wicked than she had ever been. And she fears no judgment because her walls are high, her walls are wide, and she is surrounded by a deep moat that no one can get through. But God speaks through Nahum of her destruction. Not a warning that could be averted like Jonah's was, but a description of her certain death. God's prophecy comes true when the flood comes and washes away part of the city's walls. And the Babylonian army then sweeps through Nineveh like violent floodwaters. And Nineveh's grave is so effectively dug, and Nineveh is so effectively destroyed that the city lay undiscovered for 2,500 years. The theme of the book of Nahum is that the sovereign God will judge Nineveh, the capital of Assyria. So again, we see this theme of God's judgment toward the wicked city of Nineveh. It's written by Nahum. He prophesied around 650 to 612 BC, and there's a burden that Nahum has. There are 3 chapters in Nahum, 47 verses. It's not a long book, and it's the oracles of Nahum. The term oracle is sometimes translated as burden because it comes from the word that means to lift or to carry, but because it genuinely means carrying a burden sometimes. In using this word, the author may intend to imply to us that the prophetic word is a burden to the prophet. Or It could be that the message is a burden that the audience must bear, or perhaps even both, a burden to Nahum and a burden to those who are listening. This map shows you some of the cities that are mentioned, but the two that are most significant are Jerusalem and Nineveh. Babylon, of course, are the ones that eventually destroy Nineveh and take it and smash it into the ground. The short book has really two main points. First, it tells us about God's wrath against Nineveh, and secondly, about the fall of Nineveh. What is it that Nineveh did that was so bad? Well, again, the text tells us, I am against you, declares the Lord who commands armies. I will burn your chariots with fire. The sword will devour your young lions. You will no longer prey upon the land. The voices of your messengers will no longer be heard. Woe to the city guilty of bloodshed. She is full of lies. She is filled with plunder. She has hoarded her spoil. And so we see there that Nineveh was a wicked city who was going out, taking things from other nations and taking both people and objects as their spoil. Now, Nahum has its difficulties, and one of the difficulties is that dealing with the book of Nahum can be frustrating. And one of the reasons it can be frustrating is that its depictions of violence and destruction can be somewhat discordant with the God depicted elsewhere in the Bible. But what Nahum is telling us is that God's patience for evil has an end. Even if some say otherwise, eventually God's patience comes to an end and He does destroy those who are harming His people. One of the interesting questions that we can ask about Nahum is it okay to gloat over a fallen enemy? And again, Nahum is a violent, a difficult and disturbing book. There are some very harsh things said by some critics about the book of Nahum. Nahum takes comfort in the painful justice that served to Nineveh. But in several other places, the Bible speaks against mocking or gloating over an enemy who has fallen. King David himself laments the death of those who are against him. Why then would it be all right to gloat over this enemy? The implicit message of Nahum and really of the 12 is that God's forgiveness cannot be taken for granted, that you cannot assume in and of yourself that God will just forgive forever and go on, and His patience will go on and on and on. Although the Lord is gracious, the Lord is a gracious and merciful God. He is slow to anger. It's disastrous to presume upon the Lord's grace. We cannot presume upon the Lord's grace. At some point, it will come to an end. And so we can agree with Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln quoted Psalm 19:9 in his second inaugural address toward the end of the Civil War. And he said, "The judgments of Yahweh are true and righteous altogether." And so, while we shouldn't gloat about the failure of our enemies because we don't know everything, we don't know if God is punishing them or not. God knows, and He can gloat because He has given them chance after chance after chance, and they have gone on and on and on and have not followed after Him in the way that they should. There's a fascinating passage toward the end of the book in Nahum 3:18. And it tells us about what is going on in Nineveh. Your shepherds are sleeping, O king of Assyria. Your officers are slumbering. Your people are scattered like sheep on the mountains. Remember, there we see that metaphor of sheep being scattered again. But these sheep are scattered in a different way. These sheep are scattered in really a horrendous way because there's no one to regather them. They will never be regathered. We, on the other hand, we worship a different shepherd. We worship the Lord, who is our shepherd. Thus we will not want. And so let each of us, during this time of tension in our nation, during this time when it seems like there are so many things that are going on that we can't even keep up with them, much less properly process them, let us turn our cares over to our own shepherd, realizing that we will never be a shepherd, we will never be a sheep of people that will not be gathered back up. That we have a shepherd who cares about us, who wants us to do his will, wants us to take care of the poor and the downtrodden, wants us to be stewards of that which he has given us. This is a wonderful, wonderful reminder of just how wonderful God is. But it's also a reminder that God's patience does not last forever. And so let each of us think carefully about what we are doing, how we are handling those people that are around us, how we are treating other people. And let it never be said of us that we treated people in the same way that Nineveh treated people. I hope that this few minutes that we've spent together has been helpful for you. I hope that it's reminded you that in the midst of tension and stress and all sorts of things that are going on, that ultimately we are a people of God. Ultimately, we are a people who hold to the kingdom of God. And I ask this morning that God will, in the midst of all of this stress, remind you that he is our shepherd and that he will take care of us in a way that no one else can. Be blessed today. Thanks for watching Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church's Sunday School. I'm so glad that you've tuned in, and I hope that the Lord will continue to bless you, that he will lift you up, that he will take some of the tension away from you and give you peace. Goodbye. We'll see you next week.